Thank you, Aubrey.
Andrea, there you go.
So, we're gonna share with you the story of a meme, and we're gonna talk a bit on language analysis. So, once upon a time, I was scrolling through my social media feed when suddenly something caught my attention. And it was a meme that said, there are people who know that they belong to the land, and there are others who think that the land belongs to them. So, this meme is an example of the material expression of a particular narrative around land and belonging. And it is a material action of expression of a narrative that we can perceive and engage with. So, narrative forms have material layers containing actions and expressions that we can perceive with our senses. After coming across this meme in my screen in my phone, I just stopped scrolling and stare at that image for a couple of seconds. And I read it again. And I thought about what that meant for me. So the memes are perceived through our eyes and they send billions of bits of information to our brains. Sight is one of the five senses that we have as humans, and the sensations we feel through our bodies are signals of information that we process internally at a level that we call the virtual layer of the narrative form. That internal process decodifies and assigns meaning to those signals of information we have perceived by looking at a meme. And that process of figuring out how things are meaningful or not is a process that is filtered by our personal perspectives and perceptions. So when we perceive the expressions through sensations that are decodifying the virtual layer of the narrative form. So after seeing this meme, my brain started to make connections, right? Yes, to the belonging to the land. And then I asked myself, am I one of those who thinks that we belong to land? Or am I one of those who thinks that land belongs to me? And I really think rather I'm more on the first ones. So I said, simple, this meme is, wow, so profound. I love it. And so my experience of this meme starts to take on meaning. And the concepts that we're processing through sensations starting to emerge and give meaning to the experience we just had. And so what happens is after a few seconds, I start to feel some type of way. I start to feel deeply connected to this message, and I deep within my feels because of this meme. And yes, that's how I too think about our relationship to the land. Like we belong to the land and not the other way around. So I decide to share this meme in my networks. And that decision to share is an intention that was formed through my experience of this meme. So when we talk about the intentions we have with the narrative layer, is the meaning of the experiences informing our intentions, which become actions or expressions in the material layer of the narrative. And so this is how narrative forms work in a similar way on how we think. In the material layer, the actions and expressions of a narrative, the meme, are perceived as sensations. This may make me feel some type of way or in this other way. And then in the virtual layer, those sensations become concepts that inform my intentions. Because the meme makes me feel some type of way, I decide I'm going to share, mobilize, scream, shout, cry. Intentions which then become actions and expressions again, which in this case becomes me actually pressing the share button to some other people to share my feelings in some type of way. So this is the narrative form circle. This cycle is how we can understand the ways in which narratives influence our behaviors as peoples, because these stories, they touch us at our core. They teach us on our studio as I feel some type of way of level. And because I feel some type of way, I am going to do something. And if the narrative already contains instructions on what to do, this is exactly the path I will follow. So if I do not understand how narratives work, well, I might not be able to see how they are shaping my lived reality. So narrative forms are have actions, have expressions, have material and visible layers, have virtual and hidden layer. And understanding narrative forms is very important because at a broad cultural level, narrative forms become symbolic of how people in society think and feel. So the material layer of the narrative is the stuff we can perceive and engage with, like memes and social media. And the virtual layer is the behind the scenes stuff that explain our collective experience because there are multiple bodies making sense of dominant narratives like capitalism and how this might influence our understanding of ourselves as belonging to the land or land belonging to us. So, to continue with the story of a meme, as after sharing the meme in a couple of places and make it viral in my closest circles, something happened. Like my auntie called me yesterday and she said, like, look at this photo. It reminded me of your meme that you shared. And I share it in my urban garden club and they love it. And they changed their WhatsApp group's name to people who belongs to the land. And I was like, whoa, that was amazing, isn't it? So just look, when we take a picture and try to capture the sense of a moment, we frame an experience down into a single snapshot that can become a metaphor of the whole story and the whole experience. So think of a frame as the lens through which we look at the world. You see the world through particular frames, which makes your experience coherent. And this is very important because so if we fast forward into the future of this meme about the land, some decades later, after all the collapse of capitalism, while I will be harvesting the milpa with my grandchildren, one of them will come to me and say, Grandma Andrea, that long, long time ago, there were people who thought that the land belonged to them. Really? That was a thing? I do not understand how they could think in that way. How is that you always say? And for a brief moment, I remembered that old meme that someone shared with me a long time ago in 2025, and I will reply, we belong to the land. And at this future point in time, the Simply meme has graduated to becoming an ideology that birthed new cultures and belief systems that coordinate human activity, that was in support of life and reflects the life as sacred. So, this story of a meme help us to talk about narrative forms. And so to reiterate, narrative forms function in a similar way how we think as people. And instead, one body, there are multiple bodies thinking. The material actions and expressions of narratives go from collective making us feel things to collectively making us do things. As bodily sensations we feel in response to narratives becomes frames that can become cultural concepts that can become the dominant ideology, which then becomes the invisible water we're swimming as fishes. So narrative forms are using metaphors, frames, cultures, and frames allow concepts to emerge, which give meaning to the experience we're having with a narrative. Cultures are ideological structures that place concepts at the center of social interaction. And so the narrative form is a cycle that creates collective common sense and also social truths or norms. So, to understand narratives, we need to analyze their virtual layers and understand their narrative forms. So I hope you had enjoyed the story of a meme.
Thanks so much, Andrea. And so, yeah, we've gone through Fede telling us about the mapping, which is basically visualizing the narrative space so we can think about how to shift it, which we'll go to in 2 weeks' time. And then Andrea has gone through this complex diagram, which is essentially just telling you about the embodied and bodily processes of narratives and how they influence your behavior and actions in the world. And now we're going to get a bit more technical and dive deeper into linguistic analysis or just language analysis. And we conduct a linguistic analysis in order to really understand the building blocks of a narrative. Because language, we believe, is really a fundamental driving force of narrative systems. And if we decode this language, we really start to understand the kind of underlying genetic code of the system. And it reveals a lot about how these systems replicate meaning and culture and power, and therefore helps us in shifting it. So the main takeaway here, despite me giving you a bit of technical terms, is that the key components of language analysis are identifying frames and identifying metaphors. So just keep that in your mind as the kind of simple takeaway. But going deeper into what exactly these are, we often use the term semantic frames or conceptual metaphors because this is what the linguists use. But you can also use frames and metaphors, that's absolutely fine. And so, yeah, start with frames. Semantic frames are cognitive structures that shape how we understand the world. They help us process and categorize information, for example, our thoughts or experiences in the world, by linking words to shared cultural meaning and shared cultural understanding. So, for example, when we talk about controversial public debates, like many of the topics we're all working on, for example, land politics, the language used might be about taking sides, battlegrounds, destroying one's argument, and this evokes the semantic frame of war. So you can see here the quote, communities on the front lines are fighting a losing battle against corporate land grabs. And in this semantic frame of war, there are core elements of the frame, such as winners and losers, territory, weapons, strategy. These concepts all surface within us. So these are all kind of mapped immediately onto our understanding of the issue at hand, in this sense, land politics. So you can kind of see a frame as a kind of central organizing idea or a key storyline that provides meaning, suggesting an essence of an issue, like maybe what the problem is, who or what might be responsible for it, and what should be done about it. And it's worth noting that frames operate on this more kind of embodied subconscious level of cognition, which is what Andrea was talking you through. This is what George Lakoff, like a key scholar in framing and linguistics, he talks about the cognitive unconscious and these vast, intricate works that are performed silently by the millions of circuits in the body. And yeah, so we place specific emphasis on frames in our work because they really integrate all the other levels of the narrative form in one coherent view. And we also talk a lot about metaphors. And similar to semantic frames, conceptual metaphors are cognitive mappings that help us make sense of intangible or abstract ideas by linking them to very familiar physical or social experiences in the body, for example, like the bodily experience of motion. We talk about moving forward or linking clarity of thought to sight. You talk about seeing something clearly, or we might link it to the feeling of touch or temperature. A key primary metaphor here is affection is warmth. So this is like people saying, hey, we're giving you a warm welcome, or she turned a cold shoulder on me. So you can see here that there are many sensory cues that ground meaning in the body. And they're really deep archetypal mental models. They're not just a figure of speech. For example, another quick example is the primary metaphor that growth is good. This is really an essential part of our understanding of the capitalist world and how to operate in it. And yeah, maybe we can zip to the next slide. Amazing. So I'm going to give you a couple of other linguistic analysis tools just to give you a taste of what a language analysis can entail if you're interested in it and if you want to dive deep, because it might help you pick apart the language of your narrative communities. But really don't worry about these fancy academic jargon words. Just make sure if you keep one thing in your head about language, it's the frames and metaphors. But this might help you a little bit. So first, personification. And this is a figure of speech which is used when human characteristics are attributed to something that is not human, like human emotions or actions and so on. And an example here is, say, tech platforms help us and make our life easier. And by maybe the narrative effect here is by personalizing and personifying the tech platforms, it often kind of apoliticizes the conversation and prevents a more upstream power analysis of the actors and the corporate giants maybe behind these tech platforms. And similarly, the land remembers, it attributes a memory or an agency to land, implying it's animate in its narrative effects. And then syntax, this is about kind of word order that shapes meaning. Andrea was talking about this as the meme that she brought up. And this is, you kind of flip the subject and object, and you can completely change the meaning here from domination to relationality. And then finally, metonymy is a figure of speech where one thing is referred to by the name of something closely associated with it. So it might take a complex set of actors or a system and replaces it with a single concrete image or institution, like the crown, as we associate with government or colonial powers. Wall Street is a kind of stand-in for kind of the financial industry. And we have to really be thinking of what are the narrative effects of this? What is this meaning? What is this simplifying? Does this kind of make it easier to misattribute causation or blame? Does this flatten the nuance? Like, these are the kind of questions we want to start thinking in language analysis. And don't worry, again, we will go into this in more depth in Costa Rica. But I just wanted to give you a few examples of putting your linguistic analysis hat on. So next slide, we have some repositories, which are basically in our research, in the research team, we use a lot of the frames and metaphors that are in the existing repositories. And this is because these academics have tested core elements of a frame. But note, they do fall short very much of the breadth of what we are seeing, especially non-Western language. And we at Culture Hack do plan to add to them eventually, but we just wanted to put them here in case you want to browse through them and see some frames and metaphors that are continually found in language. And I would say just use these repositories as inspiration. You can totally create your own frames and metaphors. Do not feel bound to these ones that we use. Again, we say this all the time, but you are the experts in your fields. You probably know many, many frames and metaphors because you're immersed in this language. So this is really your chance to recycle and surface all of this wisdom and now think about it through the lens of frames and metaphors. So yeah, before I pass to Melandri to give you a bit of an example, just again, main takeaways here is we conduct a linguistic analysis of the narratives, and we want to especially look at semantic frames and conceptual metaphors, or frames and metaphors. So on to Melandri to talk a bit about the post-capitalist philanthropy example.
Hi, everyone. I just want to apologize beforehand in case my voice is not super clear today. I'm recovering from a flu. But yeah, so I'm just going to be discussing this particular case study, which is our Wealth as Transition Pathway report we conducted with the Transition Resource Circle. As you may remember, we did a little bit of an overview of this, of the point of view and the listening, but I'll reiterate just for a refresher here. So the point of view for this project is that we are narrative practitioners and philanthropic actors. we see that philanthropy represents the most symbolic paradox of capitalism, using wealth accumulated through extractive systems to solve the very problems that wealth accumulation creates. Therefore, we want to transform philanthropy from a structure rooted in control and extraction toward one that serves liberation and regeneration. And in a moment, we'll see how these particular concepts of the control and extraction sort of is displayed in some of the more dominant communities versus the more regenerative language of the catalytic and alternative communities. So the objective was to map the narrative landscape within philanthropy to identify strategic intervention points that can advance post-capitalist philanthropy. And the small listening tools used here were interviews with partners and allies, as well as references made to the post-capitalist philanthropic book, as well as our big listening, which was done using a social media data scraping tool, and used keywords in order to track the most relevant conversations. Next slide, please. So as you can see here, there were 6 narrative communities identified. So the largest, most dominant community is the business as usual one, which was very much still weighted to the neoliberal paradigm and logics. Narrative community B is moving to focusing on the symptoms of the system, yet it's still weighted to growth logics, whether consciously or not. And so also forms part of the dominant communities, although starting to move slightly towards more alternative ways of thinking. Communities C and D, the decolonization and reparations communities, both focused on root causes of decolonization and redistribution. And then finally, we have E and F, which are our catalytic communities for this project, where we're starting to see the reimagining of wealth beyond the market definition to include non-monetary resources such as connection to the earth, water, seeds, and elder knowledge. So with these narrative communities identified, we looked at the semantic frames and the conceptual metaphors that operate within them. So I'll give you a quick overview of this, but you can read more in the report. The dominant narrative community, business as usual, viewed philanthropy as a resolution to issues, as can be seen by the semantic frame here, resolve problem, and the conceptual metaphor, helping is giving. This community tended to frame philanthropy and the work of philanthropy as giving back. The community, however, did not see itself as part of the problem, but rather as an agent towards solving it. And then generally across the narrative community seen here, the principal recurrent metaphor is wealth as protection against harm, which features in the systems change and decolonization communities. This implies that the purpose of philanthropy and wealth is therefore to keep communities from harm. There's also some focus on conflict, as can be seen with the semantic frame war and the conceptual metaphor addressing social problems is waging a war, which implies philanthropy has become a contested space in which philanthropists are being held accountable by civil society and their power is being challenged. And then in the reparations narrative community, we can again see this frame of war being used in the context of those fighting for philanthropy reparations, opposing those who are against it. And also relevant here is the conceptual metaphor addressing social problems is waging a war. And then finally, we have the smaller, more fringe communities, the new custodians and reimagining wealth, which are moving towards a more post-capitalist vision and contain language around interconnection and relationality, as well as and using the semantic frames such as social connection, sharing, and abundance, which reflect the move towards horizontal and relational ties. Finally, the conceptual metaphor relevant flow, which cultivates an understanding of wealth as relational, unlimited, and abundant. Tiffany will be going through a little bit, some of these in a little bit more detail so that you can see how they sort of work together.
Yeah, maybe I would just kind of wrap up top lines here of why the linguistic analysis is useful. And identifying the frames and metaphors really gave a richer account of how the narrative operates and where we should map it eventually, where we should plot it on the mapping graph. And you might want to create a table like this so you can compare and contrast and see maybe an evolution of frames between the communities. Here you can really see how different communities make sense of the same issue. For example, here it's about the logic of wealth. And it was useful to see how it moves from the logic of taking wealth is something that is taken and this is framed through extraction and scarcity, to something that is to be given, and this is framed through these kind of the charity model and moral obligation, which is very much based on a Christian kind of moral hierarchy of wealth and replicates these power imbalances, this model of giving in the charity frame. And then we move to wealth is being shared. So this is more solidarity-based understandings of wealth, framed through justice, resistance, solidarity. And then eventually we move to wealth is being stewarded. So we're moving from being shared to stewarded, and this is being framed through relationality and responsibility. So yeah, this kind of analysis just helps us to surface these underlying values and power dynamics and gives us a rich understanding of the narrative space. Ready to plot. Yes, so and then we just want to loop back to the mapping that Fede and Aubrey took you through at the beginning. And this was specifically for the Post-Capitalist Philanthropies reports. And here, actually, justice and ontology, we use a slightly different axes, but they're quite similar. And maybe this is also we advise you to use the justice and ontology axis, but you can, if you want, you can edit them aligning more towards your point of view, something that is more relevant and resonant to your narrative intervention. But here, just briefly, most communities you can see are situated in the bottom left-hand quadrant. And this is really where we see, this is where the dominant discourse or the hegemonic discourse sits. And then we move more to the alternative discourses, which sit a bit more in the middle. So this is more the decolonization community, the reparation community as a kind of offshoot of the decolonization community, because these have a strong critique of the hegemonic discourse, a strong critique of philanthropy's legacy and inherent problems. But actually, they're still kind of holding this market definition of wealth. So we only move to the more alternative catalytic communities in the top right-hand quadrant, which are basically trying to completely reimagine what wealth is beyond its market definition, as Melandri was saying. So this is more in the top right quadrant where you see kind of justice plus ontological shift. And next week, we'll talk about what we want to do with this mapping, because ultimately we want to be shifting the discourse up there to the top right quadrant, and we want to be populating this top right quadrant with more narratives and more stories. So I'm going to wrap up there because it's a lot of information about the mapping and about linguistic analysis.